Mosaic is an immigrant service organization. When I say immigrant, it includes immigrants and refugees or newcomers to Canada, and that we have been established for the past 40 years. And the main purpose is to support and empower newcomers to integrate into Canadian society. We have basically two kind service departments. I'm the Director of Family and Settlement Services, so that means that I provide, through our staff of course, provide services to help immigrants and refugees to settle, including counseling, including information referral, including a specialized program for stopping the violence, moving ahead. It is for refugees who are multi-barriered and also immigrant youth. That is the family and settlement. Of course, we have employment and language training, so we provide ESL, like what we call LINK program, language instruction for newcomers, and many of the employment programs to support immigrants and refugees to establish a new life, find out their career goal, then job placement, and eventually finding a job.
With immigrants and refugees, when they come to Canada, their first concern isn't always dealing with their personal situations, because when they're coming here, they come virtually with nothing most of the time, so they're concerned with finding a home to live, finding employment. We are there for them in that settlement stage, but then we also provide those other services if they're facing other barriers. So then we have our direct services that provide support for women experiencing violence. We also have services for men who have perpetrated violence, to work with them to change the way they deal with anger in their relationships. We basically have this all-around service for immigrants and refugees. The best thing that the community can do is to make sure that people are aware of the services out there. But when we're talking about cases of gender-based violence, it can be a little bit trickier, where you might not want to mention these services in front of people who you might not know, or even the perpetrators. I think the best thing to do sometimes, if you're suspecting that there's gender-based violence in that situation, is to speak to an anti-violence worker, even if you're not the person that is experiencing the violence. The discussion of gender equality is important because the consequences that inequality has on society, with the stereotypes that are so prevalent in society about young girls and young boys in the media, they are taught that they have less value, and young boys are taught that they can't express their emotions and that aggression is okay. So these types of stereotypes are what cause depression in young girls and young boys, eating disorders. They creates that rape culture and other forms of gender-based violence. I do think that women have a unique position in comparison to men, but we need to also remember that gender stereotypes affect both genders. I don't think that we should only be having these conversations about roles of women in society. We need to talk about men as well, and not talk about them only as perpetrators of abuse, but also allies, because we need the participation of whole communities to really make change. I'm coordinating two different projects. So one is a grassroots project to promote gender equality in visible minority communities, and the other is Equal Press, promoting gender equality in news media. Both of these projects are aimed at creating systemic change. For example, we provide service providers with the resources they need to promote gender equality and reduce violence with their clients. And more specifically, with the Equal Press project, we want to change the problematic ways in which gender-based violence is reported in the news, to prevent re-victimization of survivors, minimization of gender-based violence, and victim blaming, which can then lead to others not wanting to disclose because there's all this victim blaming going on in the media.
For Canada, we use the term integration more than assimilation, because we do believe that everybody comes to Canada have their own culture, have their own value, and have their own way of life. What we want to do is that we have the Canadian culture, of course, that we can really like working together to appreciate and look at what are the strengths that we can further develop to be together to build Canada.
If one of the goals of an organization like Mosaic or other refugee settlement organizations is to help refugees succeed and settle within Canadian society, I think probably having education programs that are kind of Western focused or are centered around Canadian history or Canadian values, I think to an extent is important, because we do want, at the moment, if you want to be successful in Canadian society, regardless of what you may think of Canadian society, you really need to understand the Canadian culture, the Canadian history. You need to be able to, if you want to go into higher education, you need to be able to understand how learning works here and the expectations of what happens in a classroom and the expectations around reading and writing and speaking. But I do think that I think, and this isn't just true in terms of the education maybe provided by Mosaic, but I think it's true of education in Canada and generally, that it could be more pluralistic. We could engage in more intercultural communication, intercultural forms of education more generally. So this isn't a critique of any particular NGO or any particular education program that they might be engaging in. It's more thinking about how within Canadian society our education systems can, teach, of course, the basic skills and necessary skills for people to get jobs and work, but how we can also, within all of our education systems, build in learning that is maybe integrating other cultures or thinking about other cultures, or maybe engaging in pedagogical practices that aren't strictly Western. I think we also have to be careful about creating this kind of Western education versus other forms of education, and thinking about where there's similarities, where there's overlap, where and not always thinking about the West being entirely different from other cultures, and thinking more along those lines can be helpful as well.
Now, when they come here, we always have the information and referral. We tell them what Canadian life is all about, and we look at what are their needs through a basic assessment. We do have an assessment to looking at the social determinant of health, looking at their mental well-being, looking at their job situation, education, the adjusting to different life, and also looking at the education system. And then based on the assessment, we proceed with supporting them through counseling, through emotional support, and also the direct service to them. For example, with the Syrian refugees that we have been doing it in the past 2 years, we see that many of them, they come here without any support, any family, but then we work with the community. We have volunteers, we have sponsors that they donate their time, their money to support them. And then we build a linkage with them and the private sponsors and the community. We bring them out to the community, we introduce them to the hospitality of Canadian to them.
So like Mosaic is kind of like the link for the settler or the immigrant?
Yeah, it is the connection
that
we are having it, either in terms of culture or in terms of workplace. And then we also provide interpretation and translation. And if they don't speak English language well, if they have to see doctor or if they have to see government officials, we do have connections and arrangement for them to get the service done.
My name is Selim Spinari. I'm the manager of Refugee Settlement Support Projects at Mosaic. From the time that I came to Canada until around 2008, most of my work was around refugees and advocating for refugees. I come from a minority community, and all of the injustices that my community suffered at the hand of the majority population was really immense, from the use of chemical weapons to forced deportation, forced displacement, forced confinement, and all those. And for me, it never occurred to me that in a country like Canada, some of the notions might have been used here too against some communities. And the city of Vancouver started a really great initiative years ago, and it was creating dialogue between Aboriginal, urban Aboriginals, First Nations communities, and immigrant communities. And the definition for immigrant community for the first time was a really interesting one. The city said that our definition is anybody who doesn't identify as First Nations, maybe urban Aboriginal. So basically everybody else covered under the immigrant community there. And when I went to the discussion, it was a round table discussion, you would have members of various communities. The stories were really similar. Stories of Aboriginal community members were really similar to the stories of refugees. So, living on a reserve versus being forced to abandon your home and territory, and then being confined to a residential complex back in our own region. What impressed me even more was the fact that some of the, when we had consent releases to be signed, some of the participants were really hesitant. They said because it reminded us how we were told that we could only sign on a paper, but then it actually took our right in our lands. And for us, it reminded me of how some of my relatives were detained and arrested, and they were forced to sign on blank papers for confessions for things that they have not even made, because they had different political opinions or because they were members of the community. So that notion, the whole thing, was actually a really big thing for me, an eye-opener, that we really need to debunk some of the stereotypes, and we have to get rid of some of our some of the things that we've started to think about in our lives, and look at it from a different perspective. And to understand the issue leads to reconciliation. Because for me, it's really, you have to understand the issues that are happening to be able to do that. And in our work with refugee communities, we are getting refugees from all over the place. We have refugees who are members of minority groups, but then we have refugees who are members of majority groups who have all their lives in their communities were told that this is the proper and right way to do it. So when they come to Canada, all of a sudden, things that they have taken for granted are not the same. They are now members of minority groups. Some of the minority groups in their communities might have bigger presence here in Canada, so it might create conflict, and the notion of reconciliation actually applies.
I think there's a potential problem of NGOs trying to implement programming that is maybe not sensitive to particular cultures, or maybe isn't particularly, they're engaging in programming that maybe it's not the right time for that programming to take place. And I do think NGOs do have the potential to disrupt the social contract, to use a political science term. So if NGOs are kind of almost replacing the state in some situations, or replacing local governance, that can be a problem, particularly if NGOs aren't consulting with local populations, and maybe aren't acting with a democratic ethos or spirit. I don't think that's necessarily a problem in Canada. I would say I think the relationship between the government, its citizens, and civil society is quite a balanced relationship. It's sometimes a difficult relationship and a tense relationship. But I think in Canada there's not so much of a concern of the NGO sector becoming too strong, but I can see in situations where the government doesn't necessarily have control over certain regions or control over certain communities that an NGO could inadvertently maybe fill that power vacuum in a way that isn't democratic and that is problematic in terms of trying to create balance between states and their citizens. I think the work of NGOs is really important, and I think we should definitely value the work that they do and highlight the work that they do and fund the work that they do. But as a society, we also need to ask about what is that balance between what our government should be doing and what the NGO sector should be doing. So sometimes maybe there's a concern that NGOs are providing services that maybe the government should be providing, given the fact that we pay taxes, and refugees who come to our country and become permanent residents, they're paying their taxes. So I think there's a little bit of thinking there to do about thinking about what jobs civil society should be doing versus what jobs the government should be doing based on the fact that we all pay taxes and these kinds of things.
A lot of our funding comes from IRCC, the Immigrant, Refugee and Citizenship. So they provide most of our funding, but my projects are funded by Status of Women Canada, and previous projects have been funded by other government bodies. So we're really dependent on the government for that continuous funding. Status of Women Canada is a national government agency that's aimed at basically empowering women and ending violence against women, and they provide funding to agencies across Canada to promote that initiative.
So we often think that most developed countries have very little in the way of actual conflict or violence towards women and men. However, some of your work focused on forced marriages, where we saw in an interview with CBC, you talked about 219 cases in Ontario in 2 years only. So can you tell us what a forced marriage is exactly?
So a forced marriage is a practice in which a marriage takes place without the free consent of individuals. So it can be that one or both people both getting forced. There's pressure and abuse in this force. So that force is considered a form of violence. And so this violence may take emotional, mental, physical forms, where an individual might be forced by using threats and coercion. It is a highly gendered practice. In the study done by the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario, they found that 92% of their cases were forced marriage, and the person that was being forced was a woman. People who perpetrate this forced marriage, their rhetoric is that, we should have control over young women's lives. It's that idea that women have less value and they don't, they can't make those decisions in their life. These important decisions need to be made for them.
I think that states absolutely should be involved in funding NGOs. States have made a lot of promises in terms of the international treaties they've signed. They've made a lot of promises about ethical foreign policy, both in their policy statements, but also in terms of their bilateral and multilateral relationships. So I think if states are going to be able to effectively implement their foreign policy goals or implement even their domestic policy goals in terms of building peace, in terms of relationships with local populations, I think states definitely should continue to fund NGOs. I don't think it takes away from the legitimacy of NGOs per se, as long as the goals of the organization or the NGO match with the stated goals of the government. I don't think it necessarily hurts their legitimacy. I do think that states need to think about their funding mechanisms and think about how they fund NGOs. It's a very bureaucratic process. It can be based on partisan lines sometimes, I think, and I think that states should ensure that a range of types of organizations are able to access funding. At the moment, I think it's probably quite difficult for very small organizations with limited human resources to apply for state funding, and so I think if they're really committed to building peace at the local level, they need to make sure that the funding mechanisms are accessible to all types of NGOs. NGOs, a range of NGOs and government representatives really need to sit down and determine what the balance is for themselves. And I think that has to be an ongoing conversation. I do think that it's probably not a conversation that does happen. I think there's a real danger of NGOs becoming politicized in the sense of them having to implement policies or engage in programs that the government of the day wants. And this is largely down to funding structures. So if aid is coming from a state, from a government, NGOs, of course, are going to have limitations on what they can do with that funding. And that definitely can be a problem. Some NGOs have been able to overcome that by maybe not accepting donations from states, so being focused more on getting donations from individuals is one way around that. But I don't think that it necessarily has to be a confrontation, or that there necessarily has to be a confrontation between governments and the NGO sector. I don't think that the politicization is inevitable. I think some of the critiques kind of suggest that the politicization of aid, the politicization of the NGO sector is inevitable because states are always going to have all the power and NGOs are always going to be beholden to these funding mechanisms that states set. I think that we can move towards a more balanced relationship where both NGOs and governments can see the benefit of working together and engaging in programming or planning programming together. And I think it's not just an issue of it being a discussion between states and NGOs, but also the communities which NGOs are serving. I feel like that's the third piece. When we get into debates about the politicization of the NGO sector, we kind of think about the relationship between states on one hand and NGOs on another, and there's this really important third party, namely, the constituents, the stakeholders, the people who are supposed to be benefiting from aid, and their voices and their needs and their concerns are even less heard in these debates.
For Mosaic, our major funding source is from government, so we have to work with the government and also work with the foundation. For example, the Law Foundation, the United Way, to help those refugees. And we had some programs that I can mention about dealing with trauma or dealing with people who come from the conflict countries that we have funded by the United Way to develop a program is mental well-being, looking at children, youngsters, and also the parents of them, to provide clinical counseling and also some pain therapy for them to really work through their emotion, because sometimes emotion won't come out immediately. Once people feel they are settled, then the issue comes out. So we really have to work in line with their pace and support them.
The role of the government with Mosaic, that's a crucial one, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they provide a lot of funding.
And also because they develop policy, and then we want to make sure that even before the policy development, we engage in dialogue. We engage in discussion with the government, some of the pros and cons, some of the challenges, and what are the better way in screening immigrants and refugees, and also in supporting immigrants and refugees.
So Mosaic is an advisor for policies as well.
And we want to be part of the engagement agent or the change agents that the government will listen, because we are working close to immigrants and refugees. We are working on the ground that they need to understand before the policy development.
I think one question that we can ask when we look at the NGO sector and we look at all the work that all the good work that they are doing in our country and abroad, is why they're having to do so much. So we look at some NGOs and we look at their mission statements and we look at all the areas of programming that they're engaging in, and it seems just almost seems like some of the NGOs need to have superhuman strength when we look at everything that they're trying to do. And I think we need to ask questions about why are they having to do so much. And it maybe relates to a point I made earlier about asking why our government maybe perhaps isn't doing these things. Why are there so many gaps in our social services? Why are there so many gaps in certain areas that NGOs are having to fulfill this huge list of functions or this huge list of roles. So I think one of the questions is first to say, why are NGOs having to do so much? There is a trend. The second point I would make there is that there is a trend in the international system, and there's academic research on this idea of mission creep. This idea that organizations often start off very small with a very limited set of objectives, very small mandate, and it's not that they intentionally want their mandate to continue to grow, but that it has to grow because of they start to see connections between their programming and maybe gender, or their programming and social welfare systems, and so they suddenly realize that to achieve their mandate they also have to branch out into all of these other things. Sometimes they're maybe having to branch out into lots of different directions because of the demands placed on them by donors. So donors, if we also look at the literature, donors often change what they're interested in, depending on who's in government or who's in charge. So, gender might be a really important part of an organization's mandate, because suddenly that's what the donors are demanding. So NGOs kind of have to shift their focus, and I'm not saying they shouldn't focus on gender, but suddenly they're now having to focus on another area of programming, and then 2 years later they look at the funding documents, and suddenly the funding documents are talking about sustainable development, and suddenly the NGOs are now having to kind of engage in programming around sustainable development. And so sometimes we see this mission creep when donors, maybe for right reasons or wrong reasons I won't comment on, but donors start to change what's important based on current politics, based on what their constituents are calling for. And that can lead NGOs to try to, if they want to continue to attract funding, they have to keep kind of reinventing themselves. So I think there's partly a funding issue there, but I also think there are these gaps in the service provision in a lot of places that NGOs simply feel that they need to fill these gaps, and so you see them taking on more and more and more areas of programming.
So do you think that programs like these are crucial in addressing violence, not only in Vancouver, but globally?
I do think that they are, to create that systemic change, but I also think that's really important is the direct services. I work more on the structural level, trying to make change in the services provided, in the policies and practices, but it's really important that we have those direct services that assist survivors who have experienced gender-based violence. So both sides of the coin are very important. I didn't really talk about the Grassroots project. It was a really interesting project. It was working in Vancouver, Burnaby, Surrey, and New West, and we had different working groups of women in each city, and they came up with ideas on how to promote gender equality. So we took their ideas and now we're implementing them. In Burnaby, their idea was to come up with a LINK curriculum that teaches about gender equality. So LINK classes are mandatory for new immigrants to take if their level of English isn't high enough. So they are going to be exposed to this concept of gender equality.
You can spread the word. And then for Mosaic, even though we do have many students coming to Mosaic to do projects, and then we take social student here from UBC in particular to a placement. I think that we always look at the university and Mosaic partnership. We do many of a partnership with UBC and other universities as well.
Yeah, so
I think that is bringing the student, and then we had 2 times the whole class of social work students coming here to learn about Mosaic and have lecture here.